نحن لا نشك في حرف واحد من كتاب الله أبدا، كله ثابت بالنقل المتواتر. بعض الناس يحاول أن يشغب على تواترية القرآن الكريم، يقول لك لا المصاحف ومش المصاحف لا 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 لا، القرآن أصلا حفظه الرئيس بماذا؟ ولقيوا قال المصاحف في صنعاء مش عارف يا رجل يا رجل، ايه كلام الفرق هذا؟ القرآن حفظه الرئيس ليس في المصاحف، حفظه في الصدور، ثم بعد ذلك في السطور، حفظه في المحاريب، أمة تتلو من أيام محمد صلى الله عليه محمد وآل محمد، هذا صحيح؟ تختمه ألوف المرات كل يوم في أنحاء العالم الإسلامي، محفوظ حرفا حرفا، ما بدنا مصاحف، ما بهمنا، محفوظ لا يمكن أن يضيع.
Qur'an is one. You go to Indonesia, all the way back to America, passing by Morocco, Syria, Saudi Arabia, it's the same Qur'an. Even if we were to burn every single copy of it, the following day, more than 100 million person who memorized the Qur'an would sit down and write it to the exact same dot.
Muslims believe that the Quran has been preserved not only in written form, but also through an unbroken tradition of oral recitation. These recitations are called qirāʻāt. There are 10 recognized qirāʻāt, and each has been transmitted through chains of reciters known as riwāyāt. So under one qirāʻah, there can be multiple riwāyāt. Some of the most widely known recitations include Hafs an Asim, which dominates in the Middle East and South Asia, Warsh an Nafi', common in Morocco and parts of North and West Africa, Qalūn an Nafi', used mainly in Libya and Tunisia, or Ad-Duri an Abi Amr, dominant in Sudan. There are many others, like Khalaf an Hamza, which is recognized as a canonical reading. And by the way, you can find variations even among a same riwayah. I will talk about that later. Muslims commonly cite certain verses as proof that God guarantees the protection of His revelation. Let's begin with the most frequently quoted verse. Surah Al-Hijr, chapter 15, verse 9. إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا الذِّكْرَ وَإِنَّا لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ. It is certainly we who have revealed the reminder, and it is certainly we who will preserve it. In mainstream Islamic interpretation, the reminder, al-dhikr, is understood to mean the Quran itself, and we will preserve it is taken as a direct divine promise of preservation. In Surah Fussilat, that's chapter 41, verse 42, لا يأتيه الباطل من بين يديه ولا من خلفه. It cannot be proven false from any angle. This verse is often interpreted to mean that the Quran is protected from corruption, contradiction, or distortion. In Surah Al-An'am, chapter 6, verse 115, وَتَمَّتْ كَلِمَةُ رَبِّكَ صِدْقًا وَعَدْلًا لَا مُبَدِّلَ لِكَلِمَاتِهِ. The word of your Lord has been perfected in truth and justice. None can change His words. And similarly in Surah Al-Kahf, that's chapter 18, verse 27, we also read لا مبدل لكلماته. None can change or alter his words. These verses don't mention the Quran explicitly, but many Muslims understand them to apply to all divine revelation, and especially to the Quran as the final revelation. Now consider this passage from Surah Al-Waqi'ah, that's chapter 56, verses 77 to 80. إِنَّهُ لَقُرْآنٌ كَرِيمٌ فِي كِتَابٍ مَكْنُونٍ. Indeed, it is a noble Quran in a protected book. Scholars interpret this protected book, Kitab Maknoon, as a reference to a preserved heavenly source, often identified as the Lawh al-Mahfuz. And finally, in Surah Al-Qiyamah, that's chapter 75, verses 16 to 19, we read, إِنَّا عَلَيْنَا جَمْعَهُ وَقُرْآنَهُ. It is certainly upon us to memorize and recite it. According to traditional interpretation, this means that God Himself oversaw the correct delivery and recitation of the Quran to Muhammad, ensuring accuracy without alteration. So, when these verses are read together, they form a very clear belief that the Quran is divinely protected, perfectly preserved, and unchanged. If that is the case, one would expect every word to be the same, everywhere, in every recitation. But when we examine the actual recitations that exist today, the reality turns out to be far more complicated. What many Muslims may not realize is that these canonical recitation differences are not limited to minor pronunciation or accent. In several cases, they affect the meaning of the verse itself, sometimes in ways that are unexpected. The examples I'm about to share show how historical transmission, oral practice, and regional tradition have shaped the Quran as it is recited today. They also challenge the common assumption that the text is completely uniform at the level of words and meaning. To make this as clear as possible, I will walk you through examples from 6 different recitations. Hafs, Warsh, Qalun, Khalaf, Susi, and Hisham. Let's begin our deep dive with the first chapter of the Quran, Al-Fatiha, verse 4. In the Hafs and Khalaf recitations, the word used is Maliki, which translates as owner, emphasizing possession over the Day of Judgment. In Qalun, Warsh, and Hisham, the pronunciation is Maliki, which means king, implying sovereignty rather than mere ownership. And in Asusi, we see Maliki with the shadda on the first letter. This emphasizes the word even more, intensifying the sense of authority. Let's look at Quran chapter 2, that's Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 10. In the Hafs and Khalaf, the verse ends with yakdibun, they lie. The problem here is dishonesty, saying something one knows is false. But in the Warsh and Qalun, the verb changes to yukadhibun, they deny or they reject as false. That's a different accusation altogether. Denial does not necessarily imply lying. Someone can deny something sincerely even if they are wrong. Linguistically, these are 2 different verb forms with different meanings and different moral implications. One describes deliberate deception, the other describes rejection. This is not a matter of pronunciation or dialect, it is a change in meaning. Let's go to verse 58. In the Hafs and Khalaf, the verse reads, نَغْفِرْ لَكُمْ خَطَايَاكُمْ. We shall forgive your sins. Here, the speaker is explicit. God directly presents himself as the one who grants forgiveness. In Qalun and Warsh, the verb changes to the passive form. يُغْفَرْ لَكُمْ. Your sins will be forgiven. The verse no longer states who is doing the forgiving, only that forgiveness takes place. Muslims may respond that the agent is still obviously God. But from a linguistic perspective, this is beside the point. Arabic distinguishes very clearly between active and passive constructions, and that distinction exists precisely because meaning is affected. A text that explicitly states, "we forgive," is not identical to one that says, "forgiveness occurs." Now let's move to verse 119. In Hafs, the verse is in the passive voice. وَلَا تُسْأَلْ عَنْ أَصْحَابِ الْجَحِيمِ. You will not be questioned about the residents of hell. The verse reassures the prophet that he bears no responsibility for the fate of those who reject his message. However, in Qalun and Warsh, it is in the active voice. وَلَا تَسْأَلْ عَنْ أَصْحَابِ الْجَحِيمِ. Do not ask about the residents of hell. Here the verse is no longer a statement of reassurance, but a command, instructing the prophet not to inquire about their fate. This shift changes the grammatical structure, the tone, and the function of the verse, from divine reassurance to divine prohibition. Let's stay in Surah Al-Baqarah and go to verse 184. In Hafs, we read, فِدْيَةُ طَعَامِ مِسْكِينٍ, feeding one poor person. In Warsh and Qalun, we read, فِدْيَةُ طَعَامِ مَسَاكِينٍ, feeding many poor people. This has real consequences for religious practice and understanding of obligation, the aqidah. Which recitation reflects what God actually intended? Is it one poor person or many? The variation here shows that even fundamental instructions can differ between canonical recitations. And now let's check verse 191, which is about fighting at the sacred mosque. In Hafs, Qalun, Warsh, As-Susi, and Hisham, the instruction makes sense. وَلَا تُقَاتِلُوهُمْ عِنْدَ الْمَسْجِدِ الْحَرَامِ حَتَّى يُقَاتِلُوكُمْ فِيهِ فَإِنْ قَاتَلُوكُمْ فَاقْتُلُوهُمْ. Do not fight them at the sacred mosque unless they fight you there. If they do so, then kill them. Now in Khalaf, it goes like this. وَلَا تَقْتُلُوهُمْ عِنْدَ الْمَسْجِدِ الْحَرَامِ حَتَّى يَقْتُلُوكُمْ فِيهِ فَإِنْ قَتَلُوكُمْ فَاقْتُلُوهُمْ. Do not kill them at the sacred mosque unless they kill you there. If they do so, then kill them. So, they have already killed you, and you are now being told to kill them in response. Suddenly, the Quran grants resurrection powers. It's one of those moments where you have to pause and laugh, because the text is literally self-contradictory. And yet imagine someone reading this in Khalaf recitation and nodding along, thinking it makes perfect sense. I think we all agree that this is a full-blown semantic and logical issue.
Allah says in Surah Nisa chapter 4 verse 82, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ وَلَوْ كَانَ مِنْ عِنْدِ غَيْرِ اللَّهِ لَوَجَدُوا فِيهِ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا. Do they not consider the Quran with care? Had it been from anyone besides Allah, there have been contradictions. So number one, there is no contradiction in the Quran. So you assuming that Allah can is nonsense.
Kill them wherever you come upon them, and drive them out of the places from which they have driven you out. For persecution is far worse than killing.
And do not kill them at the sacred mosque unless they kill you there. If they do so, then kill them.
That is the reward of the disbelievers. Contradiction is halal if it is vocalized.
And now let's move to verse 285. So this is at the end of Surah Al-Baqarah. In the Hafs recitation, the verse says, Kutubihi, his books. This fits the context. Belief in God, his angels, his messengers, and all revealed scriptures. Everything flows clearly. In Khalaf, it says, Kitabihi, his book, in the singular. Which book? We are talking about core beliefs here, and this creates a contradiction. Allah cannot say in the Quran to believe in all his scriptures, then in another Quran say only in one of his revelations. If you are translating the Quran, which version do you follow? Which one represents the true text? These are not minor differences. They touch on fundamental statements about what believers are instructed to accept. Now let's move to chapter 3, Surah Al-Imran. Imran is understood to be the father of Maryam, Mary, the mother of Jesus. In verse 125, describing divine assistance through angels during battle. In Hafs, we read Musawwimin. Here the angels are performing the action, marking or distinguishing targets. But in Qalun and Wash, we read Musawwamin. This is in the passive participle. In this reading, the angels are not acting, but rather being described. They themselves carry signs or marks, possibly identifying them as divine reinforcements. These are two different grammatical voices with two different roles assigned to the angels. One depicts active intervention, the other depicts visual distinction. So the difference here alters agency, action, and imagery. Now let's examine verse 146. In Hafs, the verse says that many devotees fought along with their prophets and never hesitated, emphasizing their perseverance in battle. But in Qalun and Warsh, the same verse says they were killed. Suddenly, the meaning shifts from the followers being alive and steadfast in battle to them being martyred. What makes this difference even more problematic is what comes next in the verse. The text continues by praising them for not weakening and not giving in. In Hafs, this makes sense. They are alive, enduring hardship, and remaining steadfast. But in Qalun and Warsh, they are already described as killed. Now let's go to verse 161. In Hafs' recitation, the verse says, وَمَا كَانَ لِنَبِيٍّ أَنْ يَغُلَّ, which means it is not possible for a prophet to betray or to steal. Here the verb يَغُلَّ is in the active voice. But the meaning changes in Qalun and Warsh recitations. The verb becomes أَنْ يُغَلَّ, which means it is not possible for a prophet to be betrayed, to be subjected to ghulul. This is no longer about what the prophet does, it's about what is done to him. Now let's go to chapter 30, which is Surah Al-Rum, verse 22, which is a verse often cited as emphasizing divine signs in human diversity. In Hafs, the verse concludes by saying that these signs are for those who possess knowledge, لِلْعَالِمِينَ. However, in the Susi recitation, we read لِلْعَالَمِينَ, which means for all the worlds or for all creation. So instead of addressing those with knowledge, the verse now addresses all existence, including beings that do not possess intellectual awareness or the capacity to recognize signs. Let's look at Surah Al-Ahzab, that's chapter 33, verse 68. In Hafs, the verse ends with وَلَعَنْهُمْ لَعْنًا كَبِيرًا, and curse them with a great curse. Here we are talking about intensity, a single, one severe curse. But in Qalun, Warsh, Khalaf, Susi, and Hisham, the word changes to لعنا كثيرا. Curse them with many curses. Now we are talking about quantity, repeated or multiple curses. So which is it? A single overwhelming curse or many curses? Both ideas carry different rhetorical and theological weight. Another striking example appears in Surah Al-Zukhruf, which is chapter 43, verse 19. In Hafs, the verse reads, وَجَعَلُوا الْمَلَائِكَةَ الَّذِينَ هُمْ عِبَادُ الرَّحْمَنِ إِنَاثًا, which means they have made the angels, who are servants of the most merciful, female. Here the angels are explicitly described as servants of God, subordinate, created beings who worship Him. But in Qalun and Warsh, that word changes to عند الرحمن, the angels who are with the most merciful. Servants of the most merciful describes status and role. It emphasizes subordination. With the most merciful describes proximity or presence. It's about closeness. And if we go to verse 24, in Hafs, the verse reads, قَالَ, he said, presenting the statement as a narrative report about what was said. However, in Qalun, Warsh, and Khalaf, the wording changes to قُل, say, which turns the verse into a divine command addressed to the Prophet. This alters who is speaking and how the verse operates within the text. Let's look now at Surah Al-Hadid, chapter 57, verse 24. In Hafs we read, فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ هُوَ الْغَنِيُّ الْحَمِيدُ, for indeed Allah, He is the self-sufficient, the praiseworthy. The pronoun huwa, He, is explicitly present, reinforcing the subject of the sentence. But in Hisham, that pronoun disappears entirely. The verse simply reads, فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ الْغَنِيُّ الْحَمِيدُ, for indeed Allah, the self-sufficient, the praiseworthy. At this point, we are no longer discussing accent, dialects, or subtle phonetic variation. This is the presence versus absence of a word in what is claimed to be the verbatim speech of God. Now, earlier in this video, I mentioned that differences don't exist only between recitations. They also exist within the same riwāyāt. Let me show you a clear example of that. Take riwāyāt Warsh. Many people don't realize that even here, there isn't just one fixed form. I found two recognized transmissions, the way of al-Azraq and the way of al-Asbahani. Both men were students of Warsh, yet each transmitted the text with his own distinct way. And it does not stop there. These two paths, al-Azraq and al-Asbahani, they have dozens of little sub-paths, each with its own rules about stretching vowels, pronouncing letters heavy or light, even moving the hamza around like if God's words were a board game. And the scholars actually tell you this is spiritual and adds beauty to the Quran, because apparently the words of God on their own are not beautiful enough. They need to be sung in exact pitches with precise rhythms, or else the angels might get bored. It's a bit like listening to the same song covered by 10 different singers. Except here, the lyrics are not just music. They are supposedly divine guidance for all humanity. And the all humanity part? Don't worry if you're not an Arab speaker. Just follow the rules for elongation, tarqiq, tafkhim, and hamza transfers, and all will be well. I mean, think about it. If this revelation is meant for everyone, even the jinn, yes, them too, shouldn't it be straightforward to read, memorize, and understand? Instead, it's a multi-level recitation tournament with invisible judges. You need a PhD in stylistic recitations just to keep up. The divine message is available in a dozen flavors. Pick your favorite. To give you a taste of the differences you might encounter if you compare Al-Azraq and Al-Asbahani side by side, let's go to Surah Al-Mu'minun, that's chapter 23, verse 14. In English, the verse says, "Then we brought it into being as a new creation." In the Al-Azraq part, the verb is read smoothly as أنشأناه. But in the Asbahani part, it becomes أنشأناه. The Hamza is gone. Variations strongly suggest an underlying issue tied to the early written form of the text. Early Quranic manuscripts lacked both vocalization, tashkil, and diacritical dots, nuqat, elements that are essential in Arabic for fixing meaning. Can you see what I mean from this photograph of the Samarkand Kufi Quran? Look at the Arabic skeletal script. You can see letters without the diacritical marks. I mean the dots above and below. And without vocalization, or vowelization if you prefer, fatha, dhamma, kasra. So without these, you can make guesses and come out with different words and meanings. And this Samarkand Kufi Quran, or what is also called the Uthmanic codex, is one of the earliest surviving manuscripts of the Quran. In 1972, workers renovating a wall in the attic of the Great Mosque of Sana'a in Yemen discovered a large collection of early manuscripts. Among them, the Sana'a palimpsest, which is one of the earliest surviving manuscripts of the Quran. It is written in the Hijazi script, al-Khatt al-Hijazi. A few diacritical marks are added later, in red, as you can see in this Topkapi manuscript. Diacritical marks and tashkil were introduced by the father of Arabic grammar, Abu al-Aswad Du'ali. He lived decades after Muhammad and was closely associated with Ali. He introduced those rules because Arabic was being read incorrectly, including the Quran itself. Who gave the authority to add those dots? Allah? Muhammad? And which qirā'a Allah keeps in the Lawh al-Mahfuz? These markings were human interventions meant to stabilize a text that was proving vulnerable to misreading. So rather than demonstrating perfect preservation, the introduction of grammar and diacritics shows that the Quranic text required correction and protection by later generations, raising serious questions about how fixed and self-evident the text really was from the beginning. Using the same consonantal skeleton, different dot placements and vowel markings can yield entirely different words and grammatical rules. Watch this.
نون تاء ثاء باء ياء
قيل قتل قتل فيل قبل قبل قاتل
Riwayat Hafs and Asim has become dominant in the Muslim world. This dominance is often mistaken for originality. Yet, when we examine the classical Islamic sources themselves, we find that the primary transmitter of this recitation, Hafs ibn Sulaiman, was not universally regarded as reliable. Major Sunni Hadith critics described him as weak or unreliable in transmission. Whether one agrees with those assessments or not, the point remains. The most widespread Quran in the world today rests on the human chain of transmitters whose credibility was debated by Muslim scholars themselves. At this point, someone might say, fine, these differences exist, but they don't really matter in practice. Well, let's look at what actually happens on the ground. Because when we step outside the books and into real Muslim societies, we discover that these recitations are not treated as harmless variations. In fact, they are taken so seriously that governments step in to manage them. Example, Morocco. For nearly a decade, the Moroccan state has overseen the production of what it openly calls a Moroccanized Quran, a version designed to fit a specific religious identity, a specific legal school, and a specific political goal. This Quran is written in a particular script, recited in Warsh, and promoted as the correct way for Moroccans to read the text. Other recitations are not encouraged, and in practice, they are restricted. Moroccan authorities argue that teaching children Middle East recitations like Hafs risks distancing them from the Maliki tradition and exposing them to unwanted ideological influence, like Wahhabism. In other words, recitation is not neutral. Words matter, meanings matter, and which Quran you hear shapes how you understand Islam. If all canonical recitations truly conveyed the same meaning, no state would need to intervene. No one would worry about children learning the wrong recitation. No one would speak about protecting society from a particular Quran. Yet here we are with printing controls, import restrictions, and an official state-approved Mus'haf. Morocco, it seems, did not wake up one morning with a unique anxiety about the Quran. This concern did not stop at the border. Cross the fence, pass the customs checkpoint, wave at the neighbor, and you discover the same instinct waiting next door. So let's take a short walk east. In 2017, the Algerian government issued an executive decree regulating the printing, importing, and distribution of the Quran. According to this law, any Quran, complete or partial, must receive prior authorization from the Ministry of Religious Affairs. And that authorization comes with non-negotiable condition. The text must strictly follow Warsh an Nafi'. Any other recitation is simply not allowed. To enforce this, Algeria established an official review committee tasked with auditing every copy of the Quran before it can be printed, sold, or imported. Their role is not only to check for printing errors, but to verify doctrinal conformity, ensuring that the text matches the state-approved recitation. Qur'ans that do not comply are rejected. Some are confiscated, others never make it past customs. So, if all canonical recitations truly conveyed the same meaning, there would be no need for state control, no need for licensing, no need for committees deciding which Quran is acceptable and which one threatens religious unity. Why do these Muslim countries feel compelled to choose which version their population is allowed to read? So far, the Quran seems to have a passport problem. In Morocco, it needs approval. In Algeria, it needs paperwork, stamps, the committee. Surely Saudi Arabia, the heartland of Islam, would be different. Surely a country that hosts millions of pilgrims from every recitation and tradition would not flinch at hearing Welsh or Qur'ān. Let's see.
أحسن الله إليكم وبارك في علمكم. هذا سائل يقول: إمام مسجدنا وهو طالب علم أحيانا يصلي بالناس بالجهرية بقراءة غير قراءة حفص عن عاصم، فهل عمله صحيح؟ وما حكم الصلاة خلف هذا الإمام؟
الصلاة صحيحة، لكن هو لا يجوز له ذلك لأنه يشوش على الناس. وقد صدرت فتوى من اللجنة الدائمة بأنه لا يجوز للإمام أن يقرأ بقراءة خارجة عن قراءة أهل البلد.
In other words, truth is not defined by revelation. It is measured by familiarity. And God's words must adapt to local habits, or else they risk causing confusion in the hearts. Welsh is permissible, but only in private. Recite it alone. Whisper it. Don't let it reach public ears, because once God's words becomes audible, it suddenly needs government-approved acoustics. This Dawah figure, Uthman al-Khamis, reported a story he heard from a fellow Muslim. So in Italy, a man attempted to lead Tarawih prayers among a congregation, mostly from North Africa, who followed the recitation according to Warsh and Qalun. So when he recited Hafs, the people immediately corrected him. After the first 2 rak'ah, he stepped back and let someone else lead. He then found himself confused when he heard a different recitation himself, but chose to remain silent as he noticed nobody interrupted the prayers. The incident created clear tension and discomfort for both him and the congregation. Let's stop here. A Quran was recited, a valid Quran, a canonical Quran, and yet it was not tolerated. It didn't sound right. So God revealed multiple valid forms of His one and preserved word, but hearing the wrong one might disturb people's faith. And this is where the familiar escape hatch appears. The Quran was revealed in 7 ahruf. A hadith found in Sahih al-Bukhari describes Umar violently confronting Hisham during prayer because he heard him reciting Surah al-Furqan in a way Umar hadn't been taught. Muhammad then confirmed that Hisham's version was also correct. إن هذا القرآن أنزل على 7 أحرف فاقرأوا ما تيسر منه. This Quran has been revealed in 7 different ways, so recite it whichever way is easier for you. And this is where everything is supposed to make sense, except it doesn't. Because the moment you ask, what exactly are the 7 ahruf? The entire structure collapses into silence. There is no agreed definition. We are told there are 7 ahruf. Yet in reality we have 10 canonical qirāʻāt, each with multiple riwāyāt, and over 30 transmissions in circulation. Some of them change meaning, some affect legal rulings, some alter theology, Others reverse agency, voice, or intent. So imagine this. Gabriel, the archangel, would reveal a verse, then tell Muhammad, "Oh, but you can also say it this way," like giving alternative words for the same verse. Is that it? Now, the hadith is often explained by scholars as reflecting different Arabic dialects. But didn't Omar and Hisham speak the same dialect? If the Quran can be recited in multiple, potentially contradictory ways, it seems that any reader could choose a recitation according to preference, habit, or even mood. And what about non-Arabic speakers and non-Muslims who rely on translations? Which version of the Quran should they use? Translating into English or any language requires picking a single reading. Most English translations today are based on hafs. This means that non-Arabic speakers are inevitably exposed to one version, even though other readings exist. So most Muslims believe they are reading the one and only Quran, when in fact they are reading a specific recitation paired with a specific translation. They are not exposed to the other canonical readings, so they can't discover those differences and contradictions. Humans are not perfect recorders of information. Far from it. There's a well-studied phenomenon called serial reproduction, first explored by the Cambridge psychologist Frederick Bartlett in the 1930s. Here's how it works. You tell a story or share a piece of information with person A. Person A then retells it to person B. B passes it on to C, and so on. With each transmission, details are forgotten, misremembered, or unconsciously altered to make the story fit expectations or prior knowledge. By the time it reaches the fourth or fifth person, the story can be hilariously different, sometimes unrecognizable from the original. And here's an example.
The Prophet said, "Whoever tells the truth will have blessings in this life and the next." The Prophet said, "Anyone who always tells the truth will get good luck in their life." The Prophet said, "If you lie less and tell the truth more, your coins will multiply." The Prophet said, "If you tell the truth, your coins will grow legs and walk back to you." The Prophet said, "If you tell the truth, your coins will roll into your goat's feed bag."
Human memory, comprehension, and communication are inherently fallible. Cognitive skills, attention spans, and personal biases all shape what we remember and how we report it. In short, people are terrible at transmitting information perfectly, no matter how sincere they are. After seeing an example of how easily human memory can distort information through serial reproduction, it's worth remembering that even Muhammad himself was not immune to forgetting. In Sahih al-Bukhari, narrated by Aisha, the Prophet heard a man reciting a verse of the Quran in the mosque and said, "May Allah bestow His mercy on him, as he has reminded me of such and such verse." Even Muhammad, the one entrusted with conveying God's final revelation, could forget verses from the Quran. And in another hadith in Sahih Bukhari, Muhammad says, "I am a human being like you and liable to forget like you." Again, Muhammad himself could forget, whether a verse of the Quran or a part of his prayer. Human error has always been part of the process, even at the highest level. During Muhammad's lifetime, the revelations were mostly memorized and only partially written down. After his death, there was no single standardized text. Different companions had their own notes. What happened next? This hadith from Sahih al-Bukhari tells us that Uthman standardized the Quran because he was worried that differences in recitation would divide the Muslim community. To do this, Uthman gathered the various Quranic manuscripts, had them copied into a single standardized version in the dialect of Quraysh, and ordered all other Quranic materials, including fragmentary manuscripts and older copies, to be burned. This shows that there were multiple written Quranic texts circulating at that time, not just variation in oral recitation. Standardization was a deliberate political and religious act. And the idea of a perfectly preserved Quran from the Prophet to us without change becomes complicated. There were clearly decisions about what would be accepted and what would be destroyed, meaning that early textual differences were actively removed. In other words, the story of Tawatur and the perfectly uniform Quran from day one doesn't match the historical evidence. It's important to note that the variations in recitation were more than scholarly debates. In the book of Al-Itqān fi Ulūm al-Qur'an by As-Suyūṭī, we can read this. اختلفوا في القراءة على عهد عثمان حتى اقتتل الغلمان والمعلمون. They disagreed over the Quran during the time of Uthman to the point that the young men and teachers fought one another. This report indicates that the disagreements escalated into physical fight, highlighting the seriousness of these variations and the urgent need for a standardized text. If they knew that the Quran came in 7 ahruf, or whatever the number, why would they argue or reach iqtitāl, physical confrontation and fighting? Not all companions agreed with Uthman. For example, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud had complained about the Uthmanic text and refused to hand over his copy when manuscripts were collected. And the man who became the third Caliph died amid serious political and social unrest. After Uthman's assassination, some dissenters initially resisted burying him in the main Muslim cemetery. And even after this standardization, we still have these different recitations, each with different meanings. If such differences existed after Uthman, what was actually present before those Qurans were burned? Now check this out. This is from a tafsir book by As-Suyūṭī. What is quoted here from Ad-Durr al-Manthūr is well-known material in the classical Islamic tradition and cannot be waved away as fabrication. There are two texts, Surah al-Khalq and Surah al-Hafd. They were written in the mushafs of major companions such as Ubay ibn Ka'b, recited in prayer by Umar and Ali, and taught to students. Let's analyze them. They are repeatedly called suratayn, two surah, in multiple isnads. They are reported with the basmala, the Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, which is significant. They are also placed between other surahs in codices, and they are described as being recited, taught, and memorized. I think this exceeds the claim of just spontaneous dua. Major companions treated them as Quran, and the reports explicitly attribute Quranic status to them. Now, classical scholars do not deny these reports. Instead, they reframe them they tell you that these were revealed supplications, dua, not Quran. Really? I mean, if something is revealed, written as a surah, recited in prayer, and taught as Quran, on what basis is it not Quran? The claim that Surah Al-Khala and Surah Al-Hafd were merely supplications and therefore are not part of the Quran collapses under its own logic. The opening chapter of the Quran, Al-Fatiha, is itself a pure dua, recited in every prayer. No Muslim disputes its Quranic status, yet the same criteria are used to exclude Al-Khala and Al-Hafd. Al-Fatiha survived the Uthmanic canon, while these two texts did not. How uniform or fixed was the text at that time? And how does this historical reality reconcile with the widely held belief that the Quran was perfectly preserved from the very beginning? The Quran is not a single static artifact frozen in time, but a text that underwent layers of standardization and editorial intervention over centuries. The Quran, or more accurately the Qur'āns we have today, are the result of a long historical process involving human decisions about spelling, vocalization, recitation, and so on. Acknowledging this requires intellectual honesty. To everyone who watched this to the end, thank you. Stay critical. End of transmission.